All right, welcome back to Low Tech Garage. We've got an interesting day here today, made a little bit of progress, and we're going to catch you up on what's going on. And first things first, we are going to need this. So, the one thing we didn't catch on the filming last time was basically that we removed the crank position sensor. It's very easy to find. It is basically bottom dead center, and it's just in front of the bell housing. It's one 8mm bolt. Pull that out, the crank position sensor slides right out. So very easy. I even left it plugged in, and I've just rested it on the rack, which sits right in front of it. My brother and I have been messing around with getting the crank locking tool in place that came with the kit. We'll show you that shortly. And basically we've figured out kind of the position to get the motor into, so I'll walk you through that now. So when it comes to four-stroke engine timing, which all of your modern combustion engines in a car will be a four-stroke engine, essentially the crank does 2 rotations for every 1 rotation of your camshafts. So that's basically when the piston is coming up, on 1 rotation it's going to be your compression stroke, and on the next rotation it's going to be your exhaust stroke. So essentially, that means that there's basically, when you lock the crank, there's 2 potential positions that your camshaft should be in. And there's one that you want to aim for, and it's very easy to identify on this. So essentially, these flat spots right here on these front little journals, or whatever you want to call them here, are essentially what you want to be facing up, and both cams should have them. So essentially, if you don't see these and you've got the crank locking tool in place, you actually need to do another 360 on the crank, which will do a 180 on the cams, and these should then be exposed. This is the camshaft locking tool, and it's extremely simple. I'll show you how it works. Essentially, it goes onto the front 2 bolt holes here where the valve cover would normally mount, and as you can probably guess, it sits on the flats of those right there, and you literally thread the bolts in, which is easier with 2 hands than it is with 1. But as you can see, it sits nice and flush, and it holds these cams in place, right? So you now have the crank locked in place, you have the cams locked in place, so when you remove all of your timing stuff, you know that you don't have the risk of bending a valve when you put it all back together. As long as your timing is set this way, even if you pull the whole cylinder head apart, when you put the cylinder head back together, as long as you set your cams that way with the flats facing up and put this tool on, you know you're not going to have any valve clearance issues. But you saw me crack a beer a moment ago, and let me show you why. So again, the crank locking tool is in place. The crank is where it is supposed to be. And we've got the cam locking tool roughed in on this side. It's sitting nice and flat. Everything is looking good. So we're going to go over and look at the other side here where, that is not sitting flat on those cams. So basically, both of these cams are shifted ever so slightly this way, where this should be sitting flat on them. So I think, you know, I knew when I got this car that at least one of the cylinder heads had been off. I think when it went back together, this head is 1 tooth off of timing on the main drive sprocket here. I have a feeling that essentially this main drive sprocket needs to be 1 tooth further back this way, maybe even 2, and that will let these sit flat, which maybe it's something where they didn't have the tool at the time or something like that when they were putting it back together. If you think about it, what's happening to me is basically a pressure buildup that's causing heat and coolant purge and things like that, right? So what I'm wondering is if potentially an intake valve isn't closing the whole way when the combustion happens. So I've got combustion happening in the cylinder, but it's bleeding up past the intake valve back into that side of the circuit, which theoretically could cause the issues that I'm having. So obviously I found several problems so far with this motor, but the nice thing is they've been identified, they're easy to address, and when it all goes back together, it's got me really excited because this thing was running strong even with all of these issues. I'm excited to see what happens when we resolve all of these issues. So now I'm going to work on renting a crank pulley puller. That is the next fun thing with this. We've got the crank locked in the correct location, but we do still need to remove the crank bolt. And you can't rely on the crank locking pin to do that. That goes through the flex plate, but a flex plate is pretty thin. So if you tried to just lean on that bolt with just the crank lock in there, you're going to bend your flex plate, you're going to have a bad time. If you French fry when you were supposed to pizza, you're going to have a bad time. So to prevent damage, inside here
essentially, ooh, that is dark. All right, I don't think I'm going to be able to necessarily show you that. Hang on. Yeah, that's the best we got. All right, so basically inside of the crank pulley, you're going to have two 8mm threaded holes that are ready to receive 8mm bolts. And they make a tool that basically goes inside of this, and it's like a long lever, and it bolts into those positions there. And you can essentially brace the lever against this chassis rail right here. Use like a couple blocks of wood to prevent from obviously crushing this this AC line here. You know, things like that, just to make sure that the force is being applied to this rail. But essentially that lever locks this in place against the actual pulley itself rather than against your flex plate, which again, you do not want to bend your flex plate. Once that tool is in place, it has a hole in the middle, which will still allow you to get a 24mm socket onto the crank bolt. You're going to want a big breaker bar. This socket is not going to do it. We have a 1/2-inch drive breaker bar that we're going to use, and even that is probably not enough. We're probably going to need a full-length jack handle extension on that. A couple of people I've seen doing this say that you need something that is close to 4 feet long to get the appropriate leverage to break that crank bolt loop. It is done up to an incredibly tight torque spec and has a thread locker on it from the factory, and obviously when it all goes back together, it needs to go back the same way. So that's going to be some serious labor, but again, it is worth doing it correctly and making sure you don't damage anything in the bottom of your driveline. So now I'm going to try and wrench a tool. So I cleaned a bunch of dirt out of the pulley here, and now got a little bit of dirt in the threads here. This is where the puller goes, so I'm going to try and flush that out with some parts cleaner. That seems to have worked pretty well. So we're going to do the other one next, and obviously we'll dry this out as well.
Alright, so now we have the threads cleaned out. A lot of people recommend chasing the threads with a tap if you have one. So this is an 8mm by 1.25 from what I could see. This is in my tap and die set, and this runs into the threads nicely, so that's a good choice. And of course we just have a little bit of WD-40 on there, just because we're clearing out some rust, so we don't need like a full-on cutting oil. Alright, get this thing threaded in like so until it says no. And then we have the little T-handle on there, just in case we need a little more leverage. Oh, feels like right about there is where we're going to need that. So there we go. And then back it out slightly. Just let it clear. And then back in again. And rinse and repeat. And relubricate as needed. I really should mention as well, this ABN tap and die set has saved my butt so many times on the Chevy and now on the Jag. It has been worth every penny. So if you're working on older vehicles, definitely consider getting one of these. We'll include a link in the description. This was on Amazon. It was an amazing deal for how big of a set it was. And yeah, just go ahead and click that link and you can see the exact one I've got. It has been really good so far. Okay, so a little bit of research, and basically we are not super comfortable locking the crank in place the way we have it. We haven't been able to come up with anything that we trust on this end, so we are actually probably going to try and get our hands on a proper crank pulley locking tool. Again, essentially it's a big handle. It has kind of like a circular piece that goes inside the pulley, lets those bolts really get secured properly so they don't twist. The handle can then kind of lean against one of the frame rails, and that allows you to apply force to the frame rail rather than to like another person or some other part of the car. And then the nice thing is that tool also has a hole right in the middle, which lets you still get your 24mm right down the middle to the crank bolt. So, you know, usually we try and avoid buying specialty tools that are specific to one project, but and I guess this is more of a universal tool for crank pulleys. But yeah, with how deep the XJR pulley is, I don't trust cobbling something together. I feel like I'm going to twist some, twist the bolts that go in or something like that and risk damaging the threads, and it's just not worth getting yourself into that situation. So not every day is a big win, but, did a little extra, removed the bolts from the timing cover, figured that was a step that would save a little time another day, still held on with the gasket and everything like that. So I'm probably going to keep this this pulley puller tool, as I'm going to need it, and it was pretty cheap, honestly. Looks like about 18 to 25 bucks you can get one of these universal kits, and it looks like it'll do the trick. but I do need to get my hands on the actual lever tool. So we're going to work on that, and hopefully during the week we're going to come back and get this crank nut cracked. Now, one thing that keeps us going even through the hard times is the occasional can of beer. So if you'd like to buy us a beer, consider subscribing to our Patreon. That would really help. And yeah, we definitely go through some of these when we hit some of the crazy points that we get to with some of these cars. So again, if you like the content you see on this channel and you want to buy us a beer, Patreon's a great way to do that. But honestly, your liking of the videos, your subscribing to the channel, every little bit helps. So thank you guys, and yeah, I'll come back for another day of this soon. All right, everyone, we are back for another day working on the Jag. Now, if you remember where we last left off, we were working on a way of basically securing the crank pulley or the harmonic balancer in place while we remove it. The center nut on that is done up incredibly tight, so you need a tool basically to secure it in place. You can't rely on the lock for the flex plate. So I have sourced that tool. It did take a little bit to get here, and I've just test fitted it to make sure I can get it to work. And I'm going to give you guys some information as well about that, because I had to do some funny business with mine. And because of that, I'm actually going to show you what the tool looks like at the end of this section of the video. But I can at least show you what the case that came in looks like, so you can see kind of roughly the right thing, which is this guy right here. So this cost me just over $100, and normally there is a giant silver handle looking tool with a cylinder in here. It's marketed for Jaguar and Land Rover engines, 3.2 liter all the way up through, I forget what they market at, but specifically it didn't actually mention the 4 liter, but I have confirmed it does bolt up to mine. The only difference is, being a supercharged motor, I actually had to do a little bit of tweaking to get it to fit. So on the supercharged cars, we have 2 pulleys here, and you can probably already see where this is going. The non-supercharged cars just have this 1 pulley, and basically the collar of this tool, which you can just sort of see starting to go down in there where my finger is plenty deep enough to get inside of that pulley, make a nice firm connection up against the actual harmonic balancer there. Now, for mine, I guess this is too shallow. It basically didn't even come close to reaching. So I wouldn't recommend you guys do this, but I'm not about to return this tool and wait another week or more for a deeper one. So what I've actually done is used longer bolts here, and also I used basically larger nuts as spacers to make up the difference so that it sits nice and flush against the back of the harmonic balancer there. That way I'm not putting all the twisting force just on the bolts themselves, because that's a fast way to twist off a bolt. And then you're dealing with somehow figuring out how to easy out those things out of there, which would be a nightmare. Now again, I do not recommend you guys do it this way. I recommend taking the extra time and finding one that specifically says it works for the supercharged cars. The only difference will be that it has a slightly thicker collar, probably an extra ½ inch on there. I mean, the collar's already about 3 inches deep, maybe a little more. So look for one with a longer one. Just be prepared that you're probably going to pay a premium for that, because they know the only people that need those are the ones that have the supercharged cars. Now again, the key point of this tool is basically to secure the crank in place while you are removing the center bolt. So what I'm going to do is actually, since everything is still in time, I haven't messed with any of the chains or anything like that, I'm going to go under the car and remove my flex plate little locking pin that's in there. Because obviously if this thing moves just a little bit while I'm leaning on it, I could risk damaging my flex plate, because that's locked basically exactly in place with hardly any room for wiggle there. So by removing that, even if this moves just a little bit here, it won't cause any damage to the flex plate. And because it's just me, essentially I'm going to get something and wedge it between here and the frame rail. And it looks like from the last time the car was apart, you can actually see this mark right here. It looks like this handle may have even just been seated directly against the frame rail last time. I'm now running a bigger secondary coolant pump here, so the clearance might become an issue there for this time around, but we'll see how that turns out. And once we have all of that set up, we get the most fun part, which is trying to actually get the bolt undone. It's done up to, I think, 275 foot-pounds of torque, and usually has a thread locker on it as well. Mine having been done previously, I'm kind of hoping that the previous owner perhaps did not put it on quite as tight. Not that that's necessarily a good thing, but seeing some of the other stuff in the car, maybe a little looser than that for mine, so fingers crossed. But if this is the first time taking your pulley off, be prepared to use a very, very long lever and a 24 mil socket. I should also note that if you're doing it the same way I am, which is basically taking the crank lock out, make sure that you take these off. If you put these on previously, make sure that these are not in place, because you don't want to be putting a ton of load on this thing, because that'll be basically transferring that load all the way through your chains and tensioners and all that. It's not good. You want everything to be able to freely rotate just a little bit to allow that handle to go where it needs to go. And the key thing is, once you get this pulley off, from what I understand, you can put the bolt back in and turn the crank back the other way just to get the lock back in place, and then take the bolt back out one more time while you're doing all of your timing stuff. And of course, again, once your crank position lock is in place in the flex plate, you can then put your camshaft locks in place as well, yada, yada, yada. All right, so as mentioned, I've removed the crank lock from underneath the car. I've removed the camshaft locks just in case we get a little bit of movement. But basically what I've done here is take two pieces of 2x4, and I've just put them kind of at an angle, leaning onto this frame rail right here to take the load of this and transfer it again into the frame rail. So basically, those are seated in pretty nicely. The handle's already kind of holding them in place. And I've got just a basic breaker bar here with again a 24 mil socket on the crank bolt. Now, I'm not under any inclination that this breaker is actually going to do it on its own, but I'm going to try first and see if we have any luck. If not, we're going to then add a jack handle to the breaker and see if we can't get something that's about 4 feet long. And from what I understand, people say even that you'll start to get some bend, but it should go. One of my favorite quotes of all times is actually from Archimedes, and it is, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." So I ended up definitely needing the jack handle, and what I did was actually add a third piece of wood here, which gave me enough angle to where I could pull down on this, and it would actually give me enough flex in the bar to actually break the nut loose, or sorry, the bolt loose. If you're having trouble, one thing that helped me was once I had this thing fully loaded, a gentle tap with a little mini sledge, and that was what got the initial crack to happen. That's where it basically first freed up. As soon as that happened, just a few goes with this lever, and it's basically started to get easier. Now it's pretty much to the point where I could probably just do it with the breaker bar, but this is a huge win. But I mean, yeah, that gives you an idea of the kind of leverage you're gonna need to make this happen. And yeah, just for fun, this is a 56-inch long bar by the end of the time that I got done. So again, a little bit of perspective on the amount of force you're gonna need to put on this thing. That is a hell of a bolt. All right, so as promised, this is what the tool looks like when it's not attached to the crank pulley / harmonic balancer. So again, this is the collar I was talking about. If you have a supercharged car, make sure you find one that has the longer collar, because you can see what I had to do here. I basically had to build up using just stuff I had in the garage. These nuts worked out perfectly because they didn't come out past the side of the collar here, and then I found some washers for this side that made them basically even to within a teeny margin. And then yeah, basically I was able to use the longer bolts that came with this kit that were actually designed for the puller. Well, I'll get those later. I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So normally you'd use these bolts to attach that tool, but I discovered that the bolts that come with the actual puller tool, which by the way, super nice touch that it includes a puller tool, were longer and therefore would make up the distance that I had to add. So that seemed to work. So yeah, this is the big mega Jaguar / Land Rover pulley puller thing. So now we're gonna move on to using the crank puller thingy. Now this kit does not come with instructions, but looking at it, it's pretty straightforward. So basically you'll find this piece here, which I believe presses into the end, and I say presses, it should go in by hand, it has just a little O-ring, into the end of the crankshaft where you just unbolted that bolt from. And that gives something for the actual puller to press on instead of actually going down into the threads. So basically, once this is actually in the end of the crankshaft, this little ball bearing-y thing at the end here sits in this little divot on that. And that's what it's pressing against when it goes to pull the actual pulley. So I'm gonna get going on this, figure it out, make sure I can understand how it all works, and then I'll come back and kind of tell you guys what's what. All right, so I have the crank puller in place, but it's important to note one thing that I don't think I mentioned earlier. When you are putting the bolts into the harmonic balancer itself, the thread goes the whole way through the balancer, and you have to be very careful not to put the thread all the way through. The timing cover on this engine is aluminum or an alloy, so it's relatively soft. So it's very easy to overshoot, and if you overshoot by a lot, basically you risk damaging the timing cover, and especially if you get them seated in and you start turning the crank pulley, you can gouge it up, things like that. So I would suggest doing the bolts finger tight until you feel them stop. That's usually when it would hit the timing cover, and then basically backing them out quarter turn, half turn. You want as much of the thread engaged with the pulley as possible, but then, like I said, back it out just a little to know that it's not actually hitting the timing cover. So as you can see, I've used exactly that method here. Basically, I backed this big bolt out as much as possible, not all the way, but just a little bit more than what you see here. I threaded these guys in until they hit the timing cover, backed them out, like I said, about a quarter turn, maybe just a hair more. And then I threaded this back in finger tight, and I actually put my finger in there just to make sure that I could feel it making contact with that little metal disc I showed you just a moment ago, so I know it's all seated together. So now, theoretically, I just put my 24mm socket on this and I start tightening, and that should, in theory, start to pull on this bar, which should pull the pulley. All right, so for you, it's been like 1 second, but for me, it's been like 20 minutes. But I do have the crank lock in place now. That was a lot of messing around. Even the tiniest little adjustment on the crank pulley makes for a big adjustment on the flywheel. When it was 2 people, it was pretty easy having one person underneath, keeping constant pressure on the lock and just kind of wiggling it a little. And right as it came into position, it just slid right in. With one person doing it, the technique I figured out was to actually thread the little bolt in that holds the crank position sensor in place, and just preload the crank lock ever so slightly when you know you're very close, obviously, like when you're within the teeniest amount, and that helps it kind of just pop into place when you get close. But like I said, we're talking fractions of a rotation, and it makes a big difference on the hole. So now that that's done, I have the crank lock in, I also have the cam locks in, and we're going to get back to pulling this pulley. So the idea is that with the crank lock in place, the flex plate will take the load of this. It shouldn't be nearly as much force as cracking the crank bolt free. And then with the cam locks in place, that if there is any extra, they just sort of help out a little as well. So I'm going to see if I can get on this just with a normal wrench, and that's enough. If not, we'll put the breaker on it and start to work that way. So predictably, I needed a lever on the wrench, but that did help the puller pull the pulley away from the timing cover. So I'm going to show you what I dealt with, but there's a nice little feature that I am very happy with Jag for putting in. So I got it about maybe 3 mils forward, basically, just about doubling the normal gap that was between the timing cover and the pulley. And I read somewhere online that with some of these, I think at least on the 4 liters, once you do that, there's actually a little tapered wedge collar in there, right? And you're actually pulling the whole pulley and the collar outward. Once you get a few millimeters out, you can actually just gently thump this with like the mini sledge, and it pops it off of the collar. And in my case, I tapped it with that hammer, and yeah, it's free. So I just need to remove the puller tool. And like I said, there should be kind of a cone-shaped collar that I can slide out, and then this pulley should just come right off.
I should probably mention that you'll want to slacken off the center bolt on the puller first, the 24mm one. Obviously, if you thump on it and that's all still attached, it's not going to go anywhere. So like I said, the one you've been cranking down on, you want to back that off once you move those 3 mils, then thump it with the hammer. So, reaching in here, there we go. This is that little tapered collar I was talking about. That is an awesome design. I really like that. And now, if I understand correctly, this thing should just kind of slide off. I probably need to use both hands so I don't like drop it, but yep, it's shimmying forward by hand, so that's promising. And there you have it. Comes off by hand. So that's the trials and tribulations of removing an XJR crank pulley. So with that out of the way now, which is a huge milestone, and also not having to remove the radiator, which is a nice touch, I've already removed all the bolts for the timing cover, so I just have to break the seal on this, and hopefully it should just kind of pop right off, and we'll be looking at the timing chains. So it feels like there might be a couple of like alignment dowels or something. And something is fighting me a little bit here. What are we getting stuck on? Feels like right around there. Looks, oh yeah, it's just a dowel. So with a little bit of shimmying, that should. There it comes. All right. Timing cover. Woohoo! Yet another big milestone. So basically, at this point, our goal is to get the timing chains off. We know that we're in a good position as far as the actual timing of the engine. That's the beautiful thing about this whole cam lock system. As much as it seems like an unnecessary step, it's actually a really nice, convenient way to guarantee that when you put it all back together, it stays in time. So I'm going to show you what I'm working with here. It does look like, well, here, let's show you. So the last guy that was working on this, it does look like they put little dots of sealant at the points where the actual gasket itself and the, you know, like the timing cover and the valve cover meet. It also looks like they put a little dot here where the cylinder head meets the block. So I may mimic that when I put this all back together as well. It's probably not a bad idea. On my small block Chevy, people do a similar concept, so I figure why not? Let's get rid of this thing. All right, here it is in all its glory. So essentially, this is our timing setup. We've got our crank sprockets down there. They time to the main sprocket on each head, our intake valves obviously, and then we've got our secondary chains up top here, which connect the 2 camshafts together. So as mentioned earlier in the video, these feel really nice and tight. These tensioners look good. There's really no play at all in those chains. But this is a little worrying. Pretty sure that tensioner is supposed to be like doing something. So something tells me I'm at least gonna need a new tensioner here, and I'm gonna have to do a little inspecting on this chain to make sure that that hasn't jacked up the chain and stretched it or something like that. May need a new one of these, I don't know what it's called, but you know, the cam mini chain thingies up here. Another interesting discovery, it looks like potentially it might have been the timing cover that was leaking. I did notice there was a ton of oil on the sump down here, and all over these lines, everything like that, and then further back under the engine. And it looks like oil might have been making it past the gasket somewhere on that bolt hole right there. You know, he's put little dots of silicone in those locations there. But yeah, this little guy right here looks like it may have been the culprit of a notable oil leak. So that's kind of interesting. I think that's going to cut it for today's work. I need to do a little bit of research just to make sure I do the correct procedure. But basically, the goal is, I believe, to take the timing chain tensioners and basically pull them back so that they're not putting tension on the main chains, lock them in place, and that should theoretically let me get the guides off, and then also from there be able to take the chain off, and that way, you know, I can free up the cylinder head itself. Because the next step is the cams themselves have to come out, which is exciting, because all of the head bolts are underneath the cams on dual overhead cam motors. That's pretty common.
And here is a quick reminder, if you've been watching this video, you've been following along, and you like the progress, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Hit the like button right now. It really does help people see this, especially other Jaguar fans. If you're liking this content, you yourself are a fan, please take the time to hit that like button so other Jag fans can find us. And on top of that, if you haven't subscribed, it's going to be a continually awesome project. When this thing comes back together, it's going to be a beast. You're going to want to see it. So please, please hit that subscribe button and consider hitting the little bell icon as well. You'll get notifications every time we release a video, so you'll be up to date and you can be the first to see it when it comes out. And of course, if you really love us and you've really been enjoying the content, consider going over to our Patreon. You can actually financially support us over there in pretty small sums, but every little dollar helps. Honestly, it really does.